Hello and welcome to Privacy Corner. I'm Robert Bateman and welcome. A big thank you to Privado AI for providing this space. Now today I'm joined by Jody Daniels, who is a certified information privacy professional, founder and CEO at Red Clover Advisors, and the author of Data Reimagined, Building Trust One Byte at a Time. Hi Jody, thanks for joining me.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
So tell us a bit about yourself, Jody. How long have you been in the privacy space, and when did you publish your book? I think it was quite recent, wasn't it?
Yes, so the book was published last October, and we specifically launched it in Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So I co-wrote it with my husband, who is an attorney in the technology space and has a big passion for cybersecurity as well. I got in the privacy space. Oh my goodness, it's been a while. It's been over 12 years. I started my career in a whole nother suite of accounting, finance, strategy. And then I got into targeted advertising and essentially stalked you for cars on the internet. And that is when the online advertising industry kind of came together to try and do some self-regulation before laws came along. And that was my entree into privacy. I was responsible for what that compliance looked like, thought this was really interesting. And then in the corporate space, built a privacy program at a company from the ground up, then went to a highly regulated company in the financial industry. And then from there, it was 6 years ago where I left to start Red Clover Advisors. And we're all about helping companies from the privacy operations perspective. So think about all the long list of to-dos companies have of all these privacy requirements we're going to be talking about. And you need people to do them. And so we can come in and help companies wherever they need us.
Great. Well, I'm sure many of our viewers will be familiar with you, Jody. You're a very high-profile figure in this area, and I know you run a podcast with your husband, who you mentioned there too, which is she said privacy, he said security, if I remember correctly.
So you are right. Yes, every house should have a she said privacy, he said security podcast going. Sometimes there's lots of privacy and security conversations happening here.
My wife tends to glaze over when I start talking about data protection. So that might not work with us. Today we're going to talk about 3 topics, and these are all relatively current. So things that have happened in the last couple of weeks, some interesting news items. Firstly, we're going to talk about this new app, what every parent in school should know about a new app called Satin. And this wasn't quite on my radar. I had heard about it, but I read about it in your newsletter, actually, Jody. So we're then going to go to Zoom, and I spoke about this in the Privacy Corner video and newsletter last week, their terms of service and the AI training controversy. And then we're going to look at a kind of overview of the new privacy laws that have either been come into force or passed this 2023. So thanks so much again, Jody. And let's start with our first topic. So this Satin app. So this is a seemingly innocent scheduling app designed for high school students. And it's kind of in the education context, so managing their timetables, assignments, and social stuff. And it's 2018 this app is from, but it's hit our niche's headlines recently. So can you tell me a bit, Jody, about what are the privacy concerns that have been raised about Satin?
Yes. Well, the way it works is any individual can go and create an account on this app. And it's a very fast growing app. It's in the top 5 apps and social media apps within the last couple weeks of being downloaded. So anyone can go and create the account. And then the idea, as you shared, is I'm a student, you're a student, we can share our schedules. Oh, look, you have this. Oh, I'm over here. Hey, let's pass in the hall. Or to keep myself organized. The challenge with it is the privacy and security controls are far and few between. Anyone can create it, which means I could be an adult posing as a student. So very similar to all the other social media apps with the concerns of predators, and all the negative, bad people that we don't want seeing our students. The other piece is the verification. It is geared for high school students. That's what the advertising and the marketing and the website will say. However, I actually first learned about it because I have a middle school student, and in the first 2 hours of our school releasing schedules, all the kids who had the app were then inviting everybody else. So it was hitting middle school, and there's no age gating, there's no verification other than a parent saying, "No, I don't want you to have that app." So in our house, our child does not have that app, and her friends also are pretty similar, so they do not have it, but many of the other classmates were sharing it. So you have an age challenge as well. The other is that it includes very specific information about the location. So it will have class number, class teacher name, class name. All of that is available. So if I am not Jody, the student in high school, and I am actually somebody else, and I'm interested in causing harm to somebody else, I can do that. I can see exactly the location and where you are. It also will hold events. So there could be some events that are taking place on the school. Hey, come out to the Friday game, or come out to the band concert, or whatever, the pep rally, whatever it is. You once again have very specific location information for minors that if as a parent or a school, I want to make sure that all of those students are protected. And so when we see this very specific information, but not enough age gating and verification and vetting and protection, these are some of the concerns from both the parent side and also the school side, because unfortunately we live in a society where there are people who will use this information for bad. And for me, the learning is anyone creating any app needs to think in that regard, not all the wonderful things it's going to do, because on the surface, that sounds great. We need to dig deeper to be able to find all the holes to be able to protect the data, whether it's kids, health, financial, or pretty innocuous about a t-shirt, maybe your retail app. All of that you have to poke all the holes to find where could a negative situation arise.
So broadly then the issue there is to do with the verification. So how do you tell users are, well, who they say they are, but less specifically, I guess, how do you tell that they're kids? Because if you wanted to, I guess it's within the realms of possibility that you could sign up for this app if you were looking for a specific child even, and maybe get some information about where they might be at a given time. So there might be a data minimization issue there as well, I guess, a privacy by design type thing with the extent to which all this very specific data is shared quite openly by the sound of it. Now, I think there have been some changes to the app since this controversy arose. I don't know if you know about that. I think they've done something in terms of verification.
They want you to enter in a school email. However, you can still enter any school email. I could pose as someone else and entering that school email that's there. The other piece is there are people who have downloaded the app, and then it will ask for sharing of contacts. So if you share the contacts, well, perhaps my daughter's contact is in someone else who has downloaded the app, but now her information is being uploaded, and she didn't say that was okay. Yeah. Again, when we're dealing with anyone, I think you should think about that data minimization. Do you really need that contact information? But at the same time, we're dealing with children. And why do I want to upload contacts or any other information from children? And if I have if it is targeted for high school, but yet again, it is sweeping downstream into middle school, how are we protecting? I mean, there's 11-year-olds in middle school who have phones who are downloading that app. And even when I go and look at the policy, it doesn't talk about from a parent perspective or a teacher perspective. I shared with our school was unfamiliar with this app. They didn't know about it. The advertising will say it's across 16,000 plus schools. Our school didn't know about that.
Mhm.
And so from a school perspective, now they have their information being shared, and that wasn't what the school may or may have wanted either. So these apps on the surface, they're well funded, they're interesting. Let's get as many people as we can to use them. Right now, it's free. Well, there has to be a monetization play. The investors are going to want a return on money. How is that going to be monetized? It's not clear right now. Are they going to use all the data and serve ads? Are they going to use the data and share or sell the data? There's no plan that has been communicated. But as someone who's been in the space for a while, and everyone these days, the internet is free, but not free, right? They are not creating this app out of the goodness of their hearts. There's investment and funding behind it. How will that data be monetized? And that
So this
concerns me, what will happen going forward.
this is something I spoke about last week as well. I think these two child safety or child privacy safety bills that are up for a vote soon at the Senate in the US, the Kids Online Safety Act and kind of COPPA 2.0, as people are calling it. And these sorts of companies might need to rethink their business models if those laws pass, because they intend to ban targeted advertising to, I think it's 13 to 16-year-olds, or extend, the COPPA protections up to 16. So might be issues down the line, I think, if you're putting a lot of money into a company like that. So let's talk about Zoom now, Jody. So this has been well trodden over social media, but still a really interesting topic. So just to summarize, Zoom updated their terms of service back in March, but it hit their headlines, I think, last week because of a few very broad provisions that purported to give Zoom a lot of rights over data, either generated by the service, as they call it, service generated data, or customer content. And one of the uses that they purported to have permission for under their terms of service was training their machine learning and AI models. Now they have clarified their intentions with this contract since, and inserted a new clause there. What's your view on this, Jody? Because I have seen a very broad range of reactions, from quite panicky to quite dismissive, like people are overreacting to this. Where do you sit on that spectrum?
Yeah, I've seen the similar reactions. And what's also really interesting is the initial reports are still circulating without the updates. So that's what's really interesting, I think, about the way these cycles are happening. You might not always get the update to correct the story, and it's still perpetuating. I think it's a little bit of both. I think you have an example of making an update. One, it wasn't clear. It looked like in one place it was okay, and in another place, no, they wouldn't do that. So the contradiction was a challenge. Anyone updating terms or privacy notice, this is a really prime example to make sure it is incredibly clear. You need someone else in the organization that's not only the legal team to be reviewing it to make sure that it really makes sense. And again, just like we talked about before, poking holes in it. That's the idea of some type of quality check, is to be able to identify what we couldn't see. Because when we're in it all the time, we're not going to be able to see where any of the challenges or issues may arise. At the same time, some of the arguments that I've seen are, we're all moving in this direction. There will be AI in all of the different tools in a variety of different ways. They were maybe the first and the guinea pig to be as public as it was compared to some others, but we're kind of moving in this direction. With that being said, it was a bit of a call to all privacy and security professionals who work in those organizations to make sure that their voice is heard, and to make sure that there is a difference between the private information that might be communicated to to a tech company that is providing a service, compared to how some of that information could be leveraged to help the overall tool. The outrage was, I'm on a private, or utilizing technology to have some type of private confidential conversation. There were concerns in the health field the financial field, of course, company and confidential information, HR conversations. If this is the means that there's a plethora of these kinds of tools, we need to be able to trust these tools. So if the data was actually going to be used from that capacity, I mean, their business would be shut down, because no one is going to be willing to use a tool like this where everyone's eavesdropping on every single word when you have significant confidential conversations happening.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that was not the intent of Zoom in particular, and likely not the intent of every other company that is out there. Again, the word choice in really making it clear what data is included and what kind of data is not included, I think, is where they had a massive misstep. And then it took almost a day for this, from what I could tell, for the CEO to clarify what was actually happening. And in my opinion, the social media post I saw from the CEO was brilliant and should have actually happened significantly earlier. It was
Yeah, I do think that was quite a
clear.
good
It was
response.
much better than the blog post, because it was very, very clear. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're not doing. And that's what they needed to put earlier.
Yeah, I spotted that LinkedIn post, and I did think it was quite well done. I must say, I mean, I think that some people are misunderstanding that I'm on totally the same page as you, and I think this is primarily a drafting issue with the contract. And it was only a matter of time until someone spotted it. I did notice a bit of noise about this back in March when it first happened, but for some reason the whole whirlwind kicked up last week. And the fact is that under that contract, they could, you know, whether the contract was fair or not, if we take those terms in isolation, they could have done whatever they were ostensibly granting themselves the rights to do whatever they wanted with pretty much anything. And the clarification in the contract, I don't know if it really helps that much, because it says, notwithstanding the above, we won't do this. But if you're saying notwithstanding the above, we won't do this, it kind of means that you're excluding that from your clarification. But still, they obviously, I mean, I will take them at their word that they don't use call recordings and so on without consent. The other thing was, of course, they used the language of consent in the terms of service, which for GDPR people is, you know, one of the 7 deadly sins. You can't consent to a whole, 90-page long agreement because consent is kind of so sacrosanct under the GDPR. But I know that there are some other companies that do this as well. So a lot of people were saying, well, what about Teams? What about so? I think the point for me, though, was that Zoom's terms were just drafted so broadly, and they were so, I mean, they given what they report to have been doing, they were unclear. And I think that's a great point about when you make those changes to agreements and privacy notices, you really need to be very careful and think about assume people will read them, I suppose. Do you think that's a good takeaway?
I do. You have to assume people are going to read them. And nowadays, especially from a privacy and security standpoint, when we have so many laws, you have thousands of watchdogs all around the world paying really close attention to this. And I believe companies should be creating their products, their services, and their terms with the customer in mind first. They are meant from, here's what the company is doing, but you have to put the customer in the middle. That is who you're serving. And if the customer is reading this, what is their interpretation? What is it that I want from them? I mean, going down kind of to basics, what is it that we were trying to communicate? What is it that we're trying to be able to get? And then you craft, a lot of it is very specific legal language to help protect themselves at the same time from a variety of other situations that aren't only privacy driven. But you have to then layer on all these other pieces and be able to read it through as if I was a customer and I was a very knowledgeable privacy and security person. And does anything contradict? And I think that's true in any product, right? Not just in this situation, but anytime we're making a change, does it make sense to the customer? And have I addressed it properly?
I would like to think there's a sweet spot where you can both protect the company in legal terms and also create something that the majority of your users will be able to understand if they read it, particularly in a privacy
I think it's going to take a while to get there.
I think it's harder with something like a terms of use agreement, isn't it? But with a privacy notice, it should certainly be doable. Not that that's what the controversy was with Zoom's agreement.
I remember once I downloaded something and it was on Apple, and it was 70 plus screens. The terms were on my little phone. It was 70. We have a little while to go, I think, to make them simple. But you at least have to read them, because you have to assume someone else is. There are people who want to read these and identify, are there any issues? So you just, kind of like in our first conversation, you have to assume that there's going to be someone who's going to use this information for bad. Here, we have to assume that someone is going to review everything with a fine-tooth comb and identify all the flaws. That is an assumption I think companies should make, and then create review processes around that.
Certainly with a product like Zoom, which has a B2B use case as well, of course. So that almost that kind of makes it even more surprising that it wasn't picked up earlier, I think. But let's talk about our final topic for today then, Jody. And this is a bit of a broader one. So the new privacy laws, and I'm going to confine this topic to the US, which I never thought I would find myself saying this, is the most interesting jurisdiction for privacy legislation right now. So I'll do a quick run through of everything that's happened this year. So we had the following laws passed in previous years and taking effect this year. We had the CPRA in California, which I've now fully converted to calling the CCPA, because it, of course, amends that original law. With the VCDPA in Virginia, Connecticut, and Colorado. Then Utah's happening in December. And this year we've had privacy laws passing and being signed in Indiana, Iowa, Montana, Tennessee, Texas, and Oregon. Those are just the comprehensive ones. Even more interesting to some extent are the kind of more niche laws. So My Health, My Data Act in Washington, and a copycat bill in Nevada, and Florida's thing, which I won't dwell on. So, Jody, I think, and this is a contentious position, some of these laws they're all quite different from the CCPA, because they're now Virginia-style laws, most of these. I think some of them are a bit stronger than California law in places. What do you think about my view there?
Well, some of those laws are definitely stronger than California in some areas. If we were to look at Virginia, Colorado, and Connecticut, for example, it's not even, I'm trying to figure out the way to call sort of the first five, because I feel like that's how everyone's going to compare them. It's I don't know, the Fab Five. I'm not sure what we're going to call it yet. So some of those are opt-in consent, for example, for sensitive data. Yeah. And California has a longer list of sensitive data fields. It includes more than the other states, but it's an opt-out philosophy compared to the other states, which is an opt-in. So when you start kind of lining all of them up, when we spend a lot of time trying to line them all up, my paper is going to get really long soon. We're going to be at like double legal size paper. You do find some discrepancies along the way. California is still one of the more stringent ones when it comes to the targeted advertising and the whole idea of sale of data. They are not consistent definitions of sale of data across. Some are in line with that concept, where ad tech and analytics going to third-party companies are considered a sale, in my air quotes for anyone who's watching or listening, my air quotes, sale of data. Other states make it as a very specific monetary sale of data. I really had to give you something. You really had to pay me for it. So that's one area that's still a bit of a big difference. And then you have the thresholds that are really different. California gives you the volume of records or revenue, and some of the other states chop the revenue part off, and it's just the volume of records. And the reality is, I think more companies meet the revenue threshold than they necessarily do the record threshold. Yeah, sure. And so as a result, I actually think you sweep more companies in because of California in that regard. And then I wanted to add one to your list, which is Delaware has been passed. It hasn't been signed yet,
Oh,
but Delaware joined the party too. So we actually have 12 that are passed and 11 that are signed so far.
right. I hadn't caught up with Delaware, so I did read the bill. Now, I'm so glad you agree with me on California as in comparison to these others, because you still hear a lot of people saying that California is the strongest. These are kind of tech lobby bills that don't match up to the gold standard. But I think you're right. The opt-in consent aspect of some of these other laws is very important. Some of them are weaker than others. Like Utah has got, you mentioned the revenues there, it's got the baseline threshold is revenue, and then the data revenues are on top of that. So that's going to, lots of companies will escape that. And I think Colorado, we had the regulations this year as well. I haven't looked at them in detail yet, but they look pretty rigorous. So if we've got, we've got the CCPA's regulations obviously have been delayed, but once we have those and we have Colorado and another few states passing regulations, this is going to get really complicated, I think. And you mentioned there I do a lot of tables in my writing work, but I'm going to have to split them or stop doing that now, because obviously there's so many subtle differences between all these laws. What do you, if you imagine you have a company operating in each of these 12 states, do you have a kind of a principle that you would apply to any company, or do you tailor advice? What do you think about complying with all these different regimes at once?
What we're finding is that companies need to comply to what they deem as the strictest state, or wherever they're applicable is the strictest for them. Because as you start to get to, let's just say 10, which is still a lot, even though we're greater than that, it's going to be very challenging to say, well, I'm only going to deal with the Coloradans this way and the Texans this way and the Iowans this way. That's going to be operationally very challenging for companies. They're going to start creating, and they already have really, processes that work. I'm going to create a single individual rights process. Here's how we're going to receive these requests. This is going to be our process to be able to manage them, and create a training that's going to be universal. Where the nuance, though, is going to come into play, in my opinion, is going to be very similar to how organizations have to treat varying HR laws and
Mm-hmm.
tax laws.
Mm-hmm.
So a company now has some overarching employee handbooks and overall employee recruitment processes and onboarding processes and all these other things. But then if you're from a certain state, they know, oh, wait, you have to get this form over here, or you have to fill out this over there, or you're in California, so you get these extra special rules, or New York City, whatever the rules are. Then they layer those on top. The same is true from a tax perspective. They have tax processes overall, but they're paying different tax to different places. And it's going to be very similar. You have to have baseline programs that work, a data inventory across the board, but we know we're going to have to add extra questions or be on the lookout for, oh, you have sensitive data, you're opt-in over here. Some companies will choose to make that universal, always an opt-in, some won't. But they're always going to need to have that baseline, whether it's data inventory, privacy impact assessments, the individual rights process. And then when it gets down to sort of the nitty gritty is when you're going to have privacy professionals, whether it's internal or external, to help you on those nuances. And again, in my opinion, it's going to be very similar to how organizations are dealing with them in other kinds of regulation.
That's I haven't heard that analogy before. Really, really good point. It's about the tax and the HR, particularly tax, I think, because, companies are used to, this is just the cost of doing business. You have to work out what each state requires, what each country requires that you're working in. And this necessity has now been extended to privacy compliance, and people are not used to it yet, but it's going to have to start being baked into what you have to do when you set up a business. It's like accounting, I suppose, in that regard. You probably need to hire someone once your company gets beyond just you in particular. I think more and more companies are going to be looking for advice on this. And I don't know if a federal law would necessarily solve the problem, because these US laws are always so crammed with exemptions and exceptions, and different states taking precedence over others, and it's getting more and more complicated. So, I mean, it's good for people like us in a way. It can be. I have had difficult conversations about it already, though, because, for example, in Utah, there won't be a right to correct. Now, it would be quite a parsimonious sort of attitude to say, well, I'm going to comply with this Colorado resident's request to correct their personal information, but if you're from Utah, then forget about it. But like you say, that there might be a good reason to vary your compliance regime from state to state in some cases. I think the strictest watermark rule is probably a good one for the baseline, like you say. So which of these laws, Jody, do you think, of the state laws that have passed this year, is there any that you think is particularly interesting, or that companies should be thinking about as early as possible, or are they all fairly operationally similar, do you think?
I think they're operationally similar. Montana, for example, has some pretty strict provisions similar to like what Colorado and Connecticut have. Texas, to me, is the next really interesting one, because the definition of small business, and really their threshold, is based on the SBA, which is the Small Business Administration,
Yeah.
which at last look was around 500 employees. So if they ever change their definition, I suppose whoever's in scope for Texas might alter too. So I think Texas is going to be a really interesting one. And they were actually a state years ago that had formed a committee to study privacy and security. And then they came out with this particular law, which to me signals that I think they'll be an active state.
Yeah.
And then one that has already passed, but has given some signals that they also plan to be pretty active, is Connecticut. And, small but mighty. It's actually my home state. It's where I grew up. And they intend to be a pretty active state. Colorado has as well. It was only in the first couple weeks Colorado said, "Hi, we're here to start focusing on the privacy law. Don't forget, we're here." And of course, we have everything that's happening in California. So I really wanted to emphasize what you had said before, where it's new and people aren't used to this yet. Some people look at it as a cost of business, and it is, just like HR and tax and some of the other regulations. You don't typically say, I don't like that HR law and I don't like paying state tax. I'm just not going to do that. I suppose there's a company out there who has, but most of them are trying to do the right thing. Maybe they've missed one because it's so complicated, but they're trying. And that is, I think, the same thing in the privacy space. Companies have to learn to build these programs out. It isn't just a little add-on to the security team or a little piece of the legal team. It is an operational piece that is going to transcend the entire organization. And it's just new. And everything new is a little bit harder to try and figure out how it's going to work. And so all these different laws, they're all unique and interesting. Building the baseline is going to be really helpful, because then every time a new one comes online, it won't be a massive lift. It'll be just enough of a tweak. And the last point I'd have is, just like you were suggesting, well, what do you do about Utah? Do you say, sorry, we won't help you, Utah person, or we'll only offer it to those who are in scope? You have people like me. So I live in Georgia. I have nothing. What do you do with me? Do you offer them to me, or do you say, no, you're Georgia, sorry, we won't? Some companies have chosen to offer, and some companies have said, nope, sorry, we don't have to, and we won't.
Yeah. It's a big commitment if you're going to extend them, particularly across interstates that have nothing. No federal privacy law, no state privacy law at all. So it's well and good. It's a case by case thing, isn't it? You get a lot of people saying that all companies should apply the strictest in all situations, but I don't blame those businesses that want to adapt their compliance regime, as long as they're meeting the rules to suit their operations, as well as ensuring that they get all the benefits of strong privacy compliance regime too. Well, look, Jody, it's been so great to talk to you, and thank you for we share views on many of these items, so that's always good. So recommendations for Jody's book, podcast, and newsletter from me. She's a great person to subscribe to on social media. And thanks again to Privado for putting on this Privacy Corner each week. They're a really, really interesting company doing privacy engineering, privacy code scanning. So do check out Privado AI if you are interested in either of those areas, which I'm sure you are if you're listening to this. Thanks again, Jody Daniels. It's been great to talk to you. And I'll see everyone next week.